Hello, economics students. Hey, today we're going to talk about production and productivity. This really goes along with what we've been discussing over the last few class periods in our introduction to macroeconomics. We've talked about gross domestic product, and we talked about unemployment and the inflation rate, and we talked about sticky prices and expectations. All of these are very important concepts in macroeconomics, and production and productivity goes right along with that. So let's get started with this picture here. I'm showing you a photograph here that was taken in Belvidere, Illinois at the Chrysler plant there, the huge employer in northern Illinois. And I begin with this picture because basically that Chrysler plant is a huge contributor to the production and productivity and indeed wealth of northern Illinois. Very important manufacturing facility there. And that's a good way to think about production and productivity. You know, it's what we're making, like cars, for example. So let's get to it. How do we measure productivity or production? And we do that through gross domestic product or GDP, which we've already discussed a few days ago. But I want to make sure that you get the definition of GDP down. It's the final value of all goods and services produced in a country in a year. And notice that I have the word final both highlighted in bold and italicized. So that's a very important word. So to illustrate why this is an important word, let's imagine that you're a farmer down in the high plains of Texas, and down there they produce a lot of cotton. So you're a cotton farmer, and let's say you're having a real good year and you sell your cotton for a lot of money to a textile mill. When you sell that cotton, does that contribute to the GDP? It does not, because that is not the final value of the cotton that you're producing. The textile mill is going to take that cotton and they're going to use it to make, for example, jeans and shirts. So the textile mill, they make the jeans and the shirts, and then they sell those jeans and shirts to Macy's department store. At that point, does the sale of those jeans and shirts to Macy's contribute to the GDP? It still does not, because that's still not the final value of all the goods and services produced. It's not the final value of the cotton. Now Macy's is going to sell that product, those jeans and shirts, to actual human beings like you and I. And when Macy's sells it, then it's the final value of all the goods and services that are produced. Okay? At that point, when you buy it at the store, it contributes to the GDP. And at each one of those stages, beginning with the farmer and his cotton, and each one of those stages, there's been added value to the product. And only when we get to the final sale does it count the GDP, because if we counted the sale of the cotton initially, that would actually be double counting the cotton, because we'd be counting the cotton again when it was sold at Macy's. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure it's just the final sale that we count. Okay, so let's look at what GDP is composed of. There's four elements in GDP. There's personal consumption. Another word for personal consumption might be consumer spending. It's what you and I do when we go to the store. That's personal consumption, the stuff that we buy. There's also investment. And remember, we're talking economic investment, not financial investment. So economic investment is when businesses buy capital goods, which they will use then in the production of goods and services. Investment, by the way, would also include when people like you and I buy a home, a house. That is also considered a form of investment. But most investment is the purchase of capital goods. Okay? It also includes government consumption. So that's spending by the government. So when the government builds a road, what they're spending on those roads is going to be included in government consumption. When the government buys an F-35 jet plane from Lockheed Martin, that will also be included as government consumption. And finally, we have net exports. Notice the word net there. So it's not exports, it's net exports. And a net export, we have to take into consideration both imports, what we buy from people overseas, that's made overseas, and what we sell to people overseas, what's made in America and sold overseas. So we take what we sell overseas and then subtract out what we import from overseas, and that gets us our net exports. Net exports is usually a negative number, because usually the United States buys more from producers overseas than what we sell to consumers overseas. Not always, but usually it's a negative number. Okay, so let's take a look at GDP since February of 1958. My goodness, look how much the economy has grown in that time. Um, I use February 1958 for a reason, and the reason is that happens to be the month that your economics teacher was born. I was born in February of 1958, and if you look what has happened to the GDP in that time, holy cow, we are producing as a country so much more than what we were doing in February of 58. In fact, this end point in this graph is probably more than 20 times higher than the beginning point in that graph. Now, if you think about that, this would imply that the United States then is producing 20% or 200 times more than what we were doing before. Excuse me, let me backtrack from that. Not that much. We're producing 20 times more than what we were producing back in when I was born. And that would also imply then that Americans in general are about 20 times wealthier than they were when I was born. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think we are 20 times wealthier today than we were in 58 when I was born. I think we're wealthier, but I don't think we're 20 times wealthier. So there are problems when we use GDP then to measure production because there is a direct relation of production to a society's wealth. And it's problematic. We are not 20 times richer and we are not producing 20 times more stuff, more value than we did in 58. So what are the problems? Well, one of the big problems with using GDP like that to measure our production is the fact that it does not take into account changes in what things cost. We've had a lot of inflation since 1958. And so things that once cost, for example, down here at the beginning of this graph in February 58, if something cost $100 then, now it's costing close to $1,000. So things that are about 10 times more expensive today than they were when I was born. So if we use GDP as a measurement of productivity and production, we're overstating that significantly because things cost a whole lot more today than they did then. So we need to adjust for that change in prices. So there's two ways we measure GDP. First of all, we have nominal GDP, which is GDP measured in current dollars. That's what I was showing you earlier, where in current dollars, we're producing about 20 times more value today than we did in February of 58. But a better way to measure GDP is through what we call the real GDP, which adjusts for inflation. And so here we have two lines. The first line is nominal GDP. The second line is real GDP, adjusted for inflation. And as you can see, there's a significant difference here. I believe here our real GDP has probably grown about 6 times more than what it was when I was born, as opposed to 20 times more. So how do we calculate real GDP? So we use something called a GDP deflator, which is a price index that reduces current prices into the prices of a base year. Well, gosh, what the heck does that mean? Well, basically, it is an equation. And what we do, we take nominal GDP, that's the first one that we talked about in actual current dollars, and then we divide it by this GDP deflator, which is a price index. We use for the deflator, to come up with the deflator, we have to use a base year. And the base year that we're using these days is 2012. The GDP deflator for 2012 is 1.0. So basically we're using 2012 prices to determine this GDP deflator. And in 2012, using that year, our deflator is 1. So nominal GDP in 2012 divided by 1 is the same number, right? So that's what it would have been in 2012. There was no inflation yet in 2012. However, today we're in 2022. The GDP deflator in 2022 is 1.26. So we would take our nominal GDP, which is about $25 trillion, and divide it by 1.2631, and that would get us our real GDP. By the way, what this is showing us here is that in 2012, real GDP was 100% of nominal GDP. It was the same, and there was no inflation yet. In 2022, prices are now 26.31% higher than they were in 2012. Inflation has added about 26% to the price of goods and services since 2012. That's what that's telling us. Real GDP is usually less than the nominal GDP, because when you divide by a positive number, you're going to get a lower number. Um, but it is possible if you had deflation where prices are actually going down, then you could have real GDP be actually a little bit more than the nominal, but that's a rarity. It rarely happens. So there are other problems with GDP though. Let's look at even using real GDP presents some problems. First of all, some statistics. Nominal GDP when I was born in 1958 was $467 billion. In summer of 2022, that's up to $25.2 trillion, a huge growth. Real GDP in 1958 was 2.9 trillion using 2012 prices. Today it's 19.9 trillion. Again, that's a big difference. This would assume, by the way, that we're still way wealthier, like 6 to 7 times wealthier today than we were when I was born, even using real GDP. And I'm not sure that's the case. I don't believe we are as a society 6 or 7 times wealthier today than we were in 1958. So what's still missing here? Well, let's take a look at this. The population in 58 was 177 million, but today it's 331 million. So population today is not quite double, but it's getting close to double what it was in 1958. So we have so many more people contributing to the GDP today that of course we have a much higher GDP. And this still inflates it. Even using real GDP, this still inflates our production because it doesn't take into account the number of people that are actually producing stuff. So what we want to do then is factor in population. So we're going to now use real per capita GDP. Here we use real GDP divided by the country's population. And now look at what our graph looks like. The bottom one is real per capita GDP. This implies that we're about 3 times wealthier today, producing about 3 times as much stuff as we did when I was born. And I think this is a more realistic number. We are definitely, as a society, producing much more value today than we did in 1958. And I think it's fair to say that it's about 3 times more value today per person than it was then. So GDP, real GDP per capita, is probably the best way to look at the wealth of a nation's people, okay, and what the nation's people are producing on a per person basis. Now, there are some shortcomings to using GDP as a measure of production. Let's take a look at those real quickly. Even though real per capita GDP is probably the best we can do, it does not measure things that we produce and don't sell. There is a lot of production out there, such as what you see here in a soup kitchen, providing meals to underprivileged people free of charge. There's real value in what these people are doing, but it is not contributing to GDP. It doesn't measure what households produce and consume themselves. If you have your own garden, you are producing goods and services here in your garden, but you're not selling it. You're keeping it yourself or maybe giving it to your friends. That does not contribute to GDP either, even though it is real production. It doesn't measure the value of leisure time. Now, if I were to pay for a camping plot, then yeah, that would actually contribute to GDP, the money I spend for a campsite. If I pay for access to ski trails, that would also contribute to GDP. However, if I just run up to Rock Cut State Park and go cross-country skiing and there are trails there, I'm getting value from that activity. It would not contribute to GDP though, because I didn't pay for it. And if I go camping out in the woods somewhere and I don't have to pay a fee for that, I'm enjoying it, I'm getting value. It wouldn't contribute to GDP. And the last one, it does not include the value of illegal production, or what we call the underground economy. It doesn't include the value of all the drugs, for example, that are manufactured in the United States. There is value there. It's unfortunate. It's not the kind of value that we necessarily want, but it is actual production and value. GDP does not look at illegal production. So even though real per capita GDP and real GDP are great tools to measure an economy and production, there are still some flaws. It doesn't capture it all. And with that, we're going to close this presentation. Check Canvas, see if you got any assignments.